Hey everyone and welcome to a global. So excited to be here with you in San Francisco Federal Reserve. We're going to talk about money, talk about the labor market, future of all of it, man. It's so great to be here. I'm glad to be sitting down with you. First off, I want to introduce.
I don't think everybody knows about it. So since 2018, Mary Daly has led the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, the largest and most diverse Federal Reserve district, representing 1/5 of the nation's population. She dropped out of high school as a teenager. She worked at Target and a donut shop until a mentor encouraged her to get a GED. From there, you charted a remarkable path, starting your career at a bank in 1996. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a little nervous. As an economist specializing in labor market dynamics and economic inequality, very important things. You have served as a research advisor, vice president, head of macroeconomics, senior vice president and assistant director of research, and executive vice president and director of research. You have published influential work on wage, employment, and labor force dynamics, and through your speeches and public commentary, you helped to demystify key issues faced by policymakers, including inflation dynamics, financial stability, and the relationship between monetary policy and inequality. You also made history as the first openly gay woman to lead a regional Federal Reserve Bank, and your leadership is underpinned by your belief in the need for public servants to be vulnerable, compassionate, optimistic, and pragmatic to help solve pressing challenges.
Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you.
Yes, I read it to you. I was like, you did all this. So I want to begin by first talking about the housing situation. So there was a letter from housing-centric associations, including the NHAB and the National Association of Realtors, asking Jerome Powell to stop hiking rates and to not sell off any mortgage-backed securities until the housing market has stabilized. And there's this push-pull that's going on with housing, like supply-demand misbalance. People who want a home can't get one. There aren't enough homes. How does the Fed balance this housing crisis with policy decisions, especially considering the impact that rate hikes have on mortgage rates?
Sure. So it's a really important question and it's complicated, but let me start with what the Fed does. We have two congressionally mandated goals: price stability, full employment, and right now we're achieving the full employment goal and missing on the price stability goal. Now, why is that so important? Well, ultimately, low inflation, this 2% target we have, is a place where people don't have to think about it. They're not making their decisions based on what's going to happen to inflation tomorrow. But when inflation's above 2%, like it is now, and it was even higher before, hitting 7%, we've gotten it down, we've made quite a bit of progress. But when it's high, people are getting up every morning and thinking about inflation, and that's going to affect their decisions. And one important decision it affects is housing. So yes, mortgage interest rates have risen as we're trying to slow the economy to get demand back in line with existing supply. But let's think before we started the interest rate tightening cycle, inflation was rising, housing inflation was really rising. And so individuals might have had a lower mortgage interest rate, but people with mortgages in some cities weren't even competitive in the market because people were paying cash and owning 2 or 3 homes, and the whole housing market was very much out of balance. And I have the 9 western states in the United States. Many of those cities, Boise, Idaho, Salt Lake City, those were where the housing prices in the United States were rising most quickly, and first-time home buyers were completely priced out of the market. So what the Fed's job is to get that price stability back in check, have that be that 2% target, and then the housing market will start to rebalance itself. But you mentioned, and it's absolutely important we recognize this as a nation, we have more demand for houses than we have homes ready for occupancy, whether those are rentals or purchase homes. And that's going to cause prices to be elevated and housing markets to be competitive. And what I'm seeing now is many discussions across the country about how do we increase the supply. And I was just in Salt Lake City talking to some home builders, and they're starting to think about how do we continue to increase supply, just not at the rapid clip we were when interest rates were lower and demand was right around the corner. And they're also starting to rethink what types of homes they build. Building homes that fit first-time home buyers' price points as opposed to maybe, the 3rd or 4th home that you're buying in your life. Yeah. And I think that's all what we have to do. But ultimately, the trade-off we face is one that was given to us by Congress. Our jobs are very simple. Our mandated goals are price stability and full employment. We're achieving full employment and we're missing on price stability. And so Congress mandates that we achieve that goal, and that's what we're working towards.
And it almost feels like there's a new normal that we're facing. Like this is a term that gets thrown out a little bit, where maybe we're in a world where inflation does remain kind of high, and historical patterns are not repeated in the way that they always were. And the Fed has accomplished in 9 months what normally takes about a year and a half to do. Like it's gone really quickly and really, I suppose, impactfully in some sectors of the market. And some would argue that it's not rate hikes doing a lot of the lifting, but supply and demand normalization. So in what way do you think monetary policy would begin to get in the way of supply and demand normalization? Like, is there something that the Fed is looking at with supply normalizing where it's like, okay, we need to stop hiking rates because it could get in the way of just naturalization?
Sure, that's a nice question, excellent question. So the way that I think about unpacking that is that you have overall inflation. And for a moment, let's just go to core inflation, taking out food and energy. I totally recognize that people pay for food and energy. In fact, those are the high value items that so many people found hard to afford. But ultimately, they're volatile categories and monetary policy doesn't affect them very much. It's more global situations like wars and who wants to produce energy at any given time, global demand. So we just take those two things out, and then we're left with what we call core inflation. And I like to break core inflation into 3 components: goods inflation, housing or shelter inflation, and then core services ex housing. It's often called super core, but basically it's all other services absent shelter services. And if you look at those things, then goods price inflation is coming down the most quickly. But that is almost entirely driven. It's driven a little bit by changes in demand because of interest rates, because interest rates affect durable goods purchases, car purchases, business investment. But it also really gets brought down by the supply chains normalizing. So as they normalize, goods price inflation comes down, and that's a good thing. That's what I would think of as an easy win on the inflation fight, and not something that the Fed policy is really the biggest contributor to. And that will continue to go down, and where it will stop and whether it will return to its deflationary pre-pandemic trend is hard to say, because there's a lot of things that could keep it a little bit higher, but definitely that's where we've already seen a lot of progress. The next one where we're seeing progress where the Fed does matter, and you mentioned it in your first question, is shelter inflation. So shelter inflation, we started raising interest rates early last year. We had signaled we were going to raise them before. Mortgage interest rates went up, refinancing went down, and housing price growth started to slow. The whole housing market slowed. That is a direct result of Fed policy raising interest rates, and that is part of why overall inflation is coming down. And then this third component, services without housing in it, ex-housing, is the stickiest, and it's the hardest to come down. It often lags the other two, and we're just starting to see some improvement in that sector. And we will need to see more improvement to feel like we're really back on a path to 2%. But I don't feel like policy is yet interrupting the return of supply and demand, because remember, what's driving supply is really the supply chain disruptions from the pandemic. And then another part of supply that is often forgotten are people. And labor supply is one of the biggest components of supply that we have. And what's really nice is that this long and durable expansion we've been in, as we get inflation down in particular, you've seen people coming back in. Labor force participation rates are rising, and so that's a very strong help to maintaining a healthy economy and also bringing supply and demand back into balance. So we have more work to do. Inflation's still high, but I don't see our policy as interrupting those improvements. I see it as aiding those improvements.
Yeah. And, going to back to this idea of a new normal where rates remain high, like potentially at 5% for a sustained period of time. Bank of America released a report today talking about, the 5 reasons that rates could stay above 5%, including sticky wages, fewer workers, record debt burdens, deglobalization, demographics, and chronic underinvestment from countries. And so I know a lot of people ask you about the present moment, but when you look out into the world beyond, do you see a world where these things come to fruition and impact how we interact with the economy into the future?
Sure, and I think really that's sort of a time where we have to step back from what's happening today and ask what's the longer run. And for that, if I may, I'll just talk about what we come into the pandemic with. And so prior to the pandemic, the principles we were dealing with is the neutral rate of interest, when there are no shocks to the economy, everything's exactly where it should be, was very, very low. Labor force growth was very, very low. GDP growth potential was 2% or lower. And the inflation targets that all countries were facing or setting, we were going to be fighting them from below. Inflation was too low and we're pushing it up. So that's sort of the world we came in with. Then the pandemic hits, inflation comes to most countries, and many countries raise the policy rate, just like the United States is, and now we have interest rates that are pretty high. And now the question is, and one that gets asked a lot, is are we going to go back to the pre-pandemic world?
Sure.
Or has this been a reset and now rates are going to be, the neutral rate of interest is going to be higher? Now, 5% is not going to be the new neutral. There's no evidence that that will be the new neutral. That's still the policy rate trying to fight back in high inflation. But you absolutely could see the nominal neutral rate was 2% inflation plus 0.5 real rate, 2.5. I completely could imagine that we go from 2.5, anywhere between 2.5 and 3 as the nominal neutral in the go forward. But that's 50 basis points, not 2.5 basis points, and 250 basis points rather. And so I think it's one of the lessons, I guess I'll say, Kyla, that I've taken from doing this job a long time, working as an economist and in the Fed, is that every single downturn I've ever been in and every single recovery I've ever been in, people have declared that the world has fundamentally changed and nothing will ever be the way it was before. And that has never proven to be true. What I learn each and every time is people come out of the cyclical downturn, they come into an expansion like we're in now, we fight back the inflation, people go ahead with jobs and careers, they buy homes, they have families, they invest in their communities. And yes, shocks come, but we have well-oiled institutions who can deal with them, and we go through it again. And yes, everything looks a little different, but if you step back and look historically, things are more similar than different, and we can learn lessons that help us go forward. So yes, we'll probably have new normal things, but they're not going to be, there's no indication there'll be gigantic resets. I mean, remember last year, everybody said nobody's ever going to work again? Millennials are never coming back to work. Yeah. Well, people work. And I see labor force participation rising, and everybody's not walking off their jobs quietly quitting, and people are, it's sort of, we call whatever we see today as the next thing we'll always see. And I think we want to caution ourselves and be patient to ride this cyclical wave, get through it, and recognize there's a future that has a lot of stability ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and getting rid of some of that uncertainty for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you said in a recent interview that holding rates steady is policy action, that recent bond market movements could be equivalent to a rate hike, depending, and also that markets are adapting to everything. And, there's this thin line between, I think you said, disorderly and orderly pricing.
Yes.
In normalization, right? So, but for the Fed, how do you balance managing markets, right, and like dealing with that side of things, and then also telling people, like everyone in this room, right, what they need to hear, especially during these really uncertain times?
So I'm going to I don't know if this is a myth you all hold or not, but I'm going to say how I do things and how I approach my work. And I'm guessing it's going to bust a couple of myths, but maybe not. So I work for the American people. I work for each and every one of you. I get up every morning and do my job because I care about the lives and livelihoods of you and your families and everyone else who lives here in the United States and works here in the United States and has activities here. That's why I'm in a central bank. We are domestically focused and we're working for all of you. Then I watch how our policy actions, which are trying to achieve price stability, full employment, an inclusive economy that works for everyone, I watch how the economy responds to our policy actions, and I watch how markets and financial markets respond to our policy actions. So I think less about myself managing markets and more about myself collecting market information to understand our financial conditions tightening, our financial conditions loosening. Because I want to understand if, the way monetary policy works is we raise the federal funds rate, and then we would lower it and it would do the same thing symmetrically. But right now we're raising the federal funds rate. That affects other market interest rates. Those market interest rates affect borrowing and investment and savings and all those decisions that consumers and businesses make. And then that ultimately makes investing and purchasing more costly. So you pull back on that, and that slows the economy, bringing demand back in line with supply, and inflation comes down. That's what my work is. So when I look at the markets, I'm asking several questions. Are they understanding the reaction function that the Federal Reserve has, that the FOMC has? Are they understanding, or do they see the data the way I'm seeing it? And if not, let me learn from what they're seeing and see if it builds my understanding. And then if the markets, in the case recently, bond yields have tightened, meaning financial conditions have tightened, that's an indicator of financial conditions broadly have tightened, it's more expensive to get a loan, then, well, if that's tight, maybe the Fed doesn't need to do as much. That's why I said, depending on whether it unravels or whether the momentum in the economy changes, that could be equivalent to another rate hike. Well, that's data. So I use the financial markets as data, and as opposed to managing them, I'm trying to communicate to them, just like I am to all of you, so that they clearly understand what we're trying to achieve. And I'm trying to see how they see things to get the intelligence that they have to ensure that I'm using all kinds of data, wherever they come from, to make the best decisions. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, no, totally.
I don't know if it's busting any myths, but that's how we do our work.
I mean, I think it's good to know, like, data is always front and focus for the Fed, of course. And I think, like, one interesting part about the data that you all collect is, of course, with the labor market, right? And the labor market is really tough to measure. Like, it's pretty confusing. You know, we're seeing strength in prime age employment, the labor force participation rate, and the quits and hiring rates have mostly stabilized back to 2019 levels, which is all good for the long-term strength of the labor market. And one could say that the labor market is being resilient, but it's also normalizing, right? With wage growth coming back in, but also being supported by productivity gains. In a recent interview, you said there was no wage price spiral, which is potentially good to hear. And it seems like the risk that the Fed faces every month move more towards potentially causing unemployment versus managing inflation, right? So is there an example of, like, these metrics that you're looking at, or, like, how do you think about balancing those two things, you know, fighting this big fight that you have with inflation, and then also making sure that the labor market remains resilient?
Sure. So that let me just tell you how I think about the two mandates we have: price stability, full employment, and they're often seen as trade-offs, right? That if you want one to be better, you have to give up the other one. But that's not always true. And in fact, I would argue in the last 9 months, it really hasn't been true, right? Because inflation's been able to come down and the labor markets continue to expand. Now, what I was worried about for most of the last year and a half was inflation was very far off our mark, and we needed to get traction in bringing it down. As we've been able to get the policy rate up 525 basis points, and we've got inflation to start on a downward trajectory, then the risks to the economy are becoming more balanced, the risks of under versus over tightening. But I'm still completely resolute that we've got to get inflation down in order for us to have a fully balanced economy. So then I get asked this question all the time, but what about jobs? And so I give two answers. And let me start with the first one, because it's really relevant for right now. The job market is continuing to expand. We need to add about 100,000 jobs a month, and we're adding far above 100,000 jobs a month. 100,000 jobs per month would just keep everything steady, right? Because it would absorb all the jobs, the new entrants to the labor force, and returning people to the labor force need. We're adding far more than that, which means the labor market's very strong. So that's good news. But let me say the other bigger thing. Ultimately, you know, I grew up in the 70s and early 80s. I came of age kind of in the 80s and get my first job. And those were the periods where we had high inflation and then we went into a terrible recession. And what I learned from those experiences is that people need two things. They need price stability and a job. So we don't want to have people say, well, I'm going to make sure you have a job, but inflation's running away, because what that does is it erodes real wages and people feel like they're on a treadmill. You're making money, more and more money each month, and you're losing purchasing power. You're losing your place in the economy on a weekly basis. So you don't want that. But of course, we don't want to raise rates so quickly or so much that we tip the economy into recession, and now people have less inflation but no job. So this is the whole balancing act we've been doing for the entire time. How much can the economy take in terms of rate increases so we can get the policy rate to a level that's reasonable to bring inflation down, and how can we do that without tipping the labor market over? I would say now the risks of how we balance those things are roughly balanced, over tightening versus under tightening, but we still have a high inflation and the labor market's still strong. So my concerns that we're going to tip the labor market over are not as high as I'm resolute that we need to bring inflation down. Ultimately, I want people to earn a living and not feel like they are losing losing position every month. That is just not, that's demoralizing, right? You make more and more money and you fall further and further behind. That's not the economy that's sustainable.
And a recent Nobel Prize winner did a lot of work on the labor market, Claudia Golden. She did all this descriptive work, so going back through archives, compiling and correcting historical data, and it changed our understanding of women in labor markets in really fascinating ways. But there was this quote that the Nobel Prize Twitter account tweeted: "Choices that affect entire careers are based on expectations that may later prove to be false." And so, what do you think that we could change about the labor market? So this is beyond just metrics and stuff, to make it more inclusive, to hedge against some of these expectations that people could have going into the labor market.
So, Claudia Golden is just, if you're an economist, she's just someone you always have said, wow, that's work that's amazing, because it's not just about the kinds of methods she used, going into archives, studying things. It's the topics she was willing to take on that were not considered like the mainstream topics you should take on. And what they've done, it's transformed how we think about the labor market. It's transformed how we think about education and how we look at history and think about these things. And one of the lessons from that is just what you say, that, if we expect people to be a certain thing, and then they make choices based on those expectations, and then we later prove them to be wrong, what's the big lesson there, in my judgment? We've left so much talent on the table. So your question is what we can change in the labor market. Let me start earlier. What can we change in how people expect themselves to be when they grow up? If someone comes to you, you're young, and so you're going to say, many of you are young, and you're going to say, I can't really affect people. You can affect people at any point in time, because they may see their world like this. And what you're saying is, it could be like this. You can go from being an options trader to interviewing a bank president and having your own following. And those are things that are about transforming people. So I think that's what the labor market has to learn, that how you start out doesn't need to be how you end. You can have a dynamic career. You can reinvent yourself countless times. You can reinvent yourself in the same occupation or job or even place, but you can do different things. And I think the labor market sort of looks for lots of experience. And what I see happening, which is great, it's one of the benefits of a tight labor market, people are looking at skills. And skills that you might gain in one profession, you can move those skills to another profession. And I think that, personally, I've studied the labor market a long time. Not only does that release the talent that's always been there, but it actually probably is the new frontier. Because if you take somebody from one profession and you say, reinvent yourself and come over to this other profession, but bring all the skills you learned in that job, that is like the newest way to create innovation and ideas. And I have reinvented myself so many times in my career, even in the same profession. Just by saying, I'm interested in that, I'm going to go work with people who are interested in that. I've worked with psychologists and demographers and other social scientists, sociologists. I've worked with a physicist at one point, and all of that made my mind expand. So I think the labor market should be this sea of talent where everybody gets up and says, I can do that, and we see what happens. Yeah. But I think, tight labor markets are good for this. People complain about tight labor markets, not workers so much, but one of the things that constraints do, tight labor markets, is it creates innovation. Mm-hmm. And I think this opportunity is to take what Claudia Golden taught us and realize we have lots of opportunity here in the U.S. and other places, but here in the U.S., and we should take a hard look at it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there's some aspects of the economy that don't have as much opportunity, right? So it feels like the beginner mode of life is gone. So the Mitsubishi Mirage, which is I think the last car that was selling for under 20K, they're discontinuing it. And so now I don't think there's any cars that are selling less than 20K. And so what would you say to this idea that it feels like there isn't accessibility beginning in life? Like, it's really hard to get a house, cars are very, very expensive. What would you say to young people who are grappling with, dealing with that?
So, one thing that, I mentioned, so it's worth mentioning again. So every generation is going to have some challenge that seems different than the generation right before. That's just the way it goes, right? That this generation comes in, and you all, many of you, there's a wide range of generations here, but you could face the financial crisis. You could have seen your parents in the financial crisis. Then we have a pandemic. Now we have high inflation. When I came out of school and I started entering, college and go to the labor market, it was high inflation and a very poor job market, and we were in a major recession. So what I learned from that is to take the moment in and get through it, but not lose hope for the next time. So I said, well, what do I want to be? How do I want to be in the world? What do I want to do? So I had, as many of us do, you buy your first car as used because you can't afford the new one, and you just work your way up. And if a new car is what you want, you eventually get one, but you don't have to have it today. The same thing with a house. You might say, well, I can't buy a house right now, Mary, but I want one. Well, then start thinking about how to save and work on that so that when interest rates come down and you're ready, you can get in there and get it. But it doesn't mean your life is stalled out, right? It just means you're working on that. And I think ultimately what I say is this economy right now is imbalanced. That's why we have high inflation. We are working hard at the Fed to make sure it comes back into balance. When things are more in balance, when inflation's 2% and the economy is growing in a regular way, all the decisions you're forced to make seem more manageable. And right now, then we have all those pressures. You're trying to keep up, inflation's coming up, it's hard to buy a house, it's hard to buy a car, et cetera. Everything seems just like it'll always last, and it won't always last. That's the benefit of living a long time. You've seen everything once or twice before, and you realize it comes and it goes, and the people who prepare themselves while it's there to grab it when we're out of it are the people who are in the best position. So ready yourselves for when interest rates go down, for when the economy comes back into balance. Get yourselves ready to go, and then go forward. It's a good opportunity right when we emerge from a transition, and we're emerging from the transition. That's the other piece of good news. Inflation is coming down. Interest rate raising is working. The economy is coming back into balance after the pandemic, and ultimately supply and demand will equalize, and it will get easier.
And I want to zoom out to like super big picture. There is a lot of geopolitical unrest, which is a super reductive summary of what's going on. But how does the Federal Reserve incorporate that into their worldview and the policy actions?
So, when you think about things like wars and the outbreak of war, well, the first thing that happens, and I think this is true for all of us, is we just recognize the human toll. And that's got to be first and foremost, to take on the human toll of things tragic like wars. What we then, of course, do, because our role is about the domestic economy and price stability and economic growth and full employment, is we think about what is this doing to our growth, and if not to our growth, to uncertainty. And so right now, geopolitical uncertainty is adding to already some domestic uncertainty and some uncertainty about where the future's, what does it hold and how fast will it come? And that is just something that makes people they're a little more cautious. When uncertainty rises, businesses are a little more cautious about hiring, building out output. Consumers become a little more cautious about spending because they want to be ready for whatever it is. But that's how I factor it in. And then, of course, if it changes oil prices or it changes demand for exports or something, we would monitor that. It's just the data that comes in. So it's not that we rotate everything to that, but we absolutely pay attention to it. But it's part of a large dashboard of data that we're always following. And I gave a talk last week, a speech in New York, and I used two words. We need to use vigilance and agility. Mm-hmm. So we need to be vigilant to keep watching the data, constantly looking at the dashboard of indicators out in our communities, talking to people like yourself, interviewing with you, thinking about these things. And then we need to be agile enough to adjust policy so that when conditions change, we can change. Because if we get stuck, we're only doing one thing, and we're not vigilant at watching the data and agile in adjusting how we see the world, well, then we can end up with policy mistakes. And so that's why you hear us say we're data dependent. If I unpack data dependence, it's really vigilance and agility. Mm-hmm. Those are the two things that we're bringing to the table when we deliberate and debate what to do next. Always with the mind, again, just to reinforce this, always with the mind that we're serving all of you. And our goals are given, and they're simple. Mm-hmm. Price stability, full employment. There'll be a quiz later.
So this will be my final question, then we'll go to Q&A from the audience as well as online. So at your 2019 Syracuse commencement address, you mentioned that your favorite people in the policy-making space are those that disagree with you or that you disagree with. I'm not going to ask you who you disagree with, but what are some things that you have disagreed with recently that you've come to change your mind on?
That's a terrific question, and wow, I love it when people read stuff back to me that I didn't expect. Okay, but seriously, You know, you said something, you won't ask me who I disagree with. Really, really the best part of your life can be this, the best part of policymaking, the best part of having people surround you. It won't be you always disagree with this person. It will be different people take up a different stance and argue it. That's when it really is working, right? It's not that you just disagree with this person because you have a different value system or whatever. It's that different people they just see the world differently and then they think about it. So here's an example. I was a great champion of labor force participation could absolutely go up after the financial crisis, when people said, no, it's going to be stuck where it was right after the financial crisis, and I was one of the people pushing it. Interestingly, after the pandemic, I did get worried that we were just going to see it not come back, and that, because of the problems with childcare, because of the problems with commuting distances and gas prices and things, we would just see that stalling out. And I have a couple of younger team members working on this topic, and they revitalized some of my old work and reminded me and said, no, I think if you do it this way, you can see something positive. And I was like, I don't think so. Sure enough, they're right. And I changed my mind. But they disagreed with me not by just saying, well, I don't agree. They brought me evidence, and they said, okay, here's what would need to happen if we're going to see this rise. And so then I said, well, what are we going to watch? Well, we're going to watch what happens to female labor force participation. We're going to find out what happens to younger people's labor force participation. We're going to find out what happens when the dust settles and the pandemic settles down and people go back to work. And they led me they took me through all their information, and that disagreement did two things. One, it proved to be right, but that's actually not the most important thing. The most important thing is it made me less sure of what my prior was. And that made me say, and if you go back to my public commentary, you'll notice this, that we actually don't know what's going to happen with participation. Because I came in thinking, I'm not as optimistic, but their evidence and their risk assessment cautioned me from being declarative. And I think that's what's really great about policy. Yes, let's be declarative about things we know, but let's also be very humble about when we don't know and just communicate effectively that we're watching it, but we don't yet know. And the data will guide us. And that's what makes good policy, letting the data guide us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So now we'll go to the audience for any questions. Yeah. Do you want to walk up to this mic in the middle?
There's a mic in the middle.
Yeah. Or you can just, I think I can probably hear you if you would, okay. You're in the middle, yeah.
I'm reading The Lords of Easy Money, and Tom Honig talks about the lagging effect of what happens, and we all have the short-term approach of what the Fed can do to solve the current problems, but then he talks about asset inflation and how this develops over time. And the book is very deep into quantitative easing and how that has affected long-term asset bubbles. And could you just talk a little bit about the quantitative easing and now the reduction in money supply and how you see that playing out over time, as well as the current situation and how you see that in the lagging and leading effects down the road?
Sure.
On both asset and price inflation.
Sure, and just to bring everybody up into this, in case you don't follow quantitative easing and quantitative tightening as much. So let me just talk through what it is, and then I'll say a few words about that. So, the Federal Reserve's first and foremost tool is lowering and raising the funds rate, the federal funds rate. And that's one that everybody knows about, and that's the one we use all the time. That's our first and best tool because we have the most history with it. It's our primary instrument. Our second most utilized tool is something we call forward guidance. And we've been using that for a long time, almost 2 decades now. And forward guidance just means that we communicate what we think the path of policy will likely be. And you can do that in all kinds of ways. You can do it through press conferences of the chair. You can do it through the summary of economic projections. You can do it by, having your leader stand up and give a speech. And all of that is about forward guidance, saying what you think we're going to have to do for a while. And if you watch Chair Powell's press conferences, he's providing some of that forward guidance as we do in our statement and as we do in our summary of economic projections. The third tool, and the one that we really had to pull out and use, we had used it at previous points in history, but not since the Great Depression and its aftermath. The one we used was the asset purchases, growing our balance sheet. And we did that right after the financial crisis for a principal reason. Interest rates were already low, and then we had to lower them a lot. So we want to lower them, but we hit the zero lower bound. And we don't have negative interest rates in the United States, so that meant we could only lower them so much, and the economy needed us to lower them like 5 percentage points. We could only lower them by 2 percentage points or 3 percentage points, so we had to really do something else. So we bought assets. And when we buy assets, we give out money and we hold assets. And so that puts more money in, which is equivalent to lowering the interest rate. That's quantitative easing, growing the balance sheet, using asset purchases for an attempt to put further accommodation into the system. So then when you reduce your balance sheet and renormalize it, then it is often called quantitative tightening. And I think of it as just normalization, but a lot of market participants will call it quantitative tightening. And it's simply if you grew your balance sheet a lot to stimulate the economy or accommodate the economy, now you're reducing your balance sheet to come back more to a normal regime. So it's similar to bringing the interest rate back to a normal level. Now, I told you that the first tool we have is the funds rate. The second tool we have is forward guidance, in my judgment. That's the second best tool. That's my judgment, by the way, not anyone else's necessarily in the Federal Reserve. But the third one is this quantitative easing. And so we've only just really used quantitative easing in a big way after the 2007 financial crisis. So we have much less history with it, and we're still studying it quite a lot. And so then as we're studying it and thinking about when does it work, when doesn't it work, it's certainly in our toolkit, then we have the pandemic and we have to once again use it because we're near the zero lower bound, we've reduced interest rates as far as we could, and then we have to use asset purchases to further accommodate the economy. And now we're in a period where we're normalizing the balance sheet. The way we try to do that is as gently as we can. So we don't want to cause market disruptions by doing this, so we raise the balance sheet gradually, we buy assets gradually, and then we taper off asset purchases, or in this case, we're not reinvesting them, and we're rolling them off in a fixed quantity each month. And when we do that, it's really to just continue it to normalize, but it's in the background. And most studies will offer that the entire effect of the balance sheet reduction is priced in the minute we announce what we're doing. And so it's not further tightening conditions because it's already been priced in, but we will want to watch it and make sure that we don't go too far and then we don't have a sufficient number of assets. We run an ample reserves regime and we don't want to run below that or else we can cause market dysfunction. So that's what we watch. And we are, as the chair has said, we are not in a position where we think that's a problem right now. But we study it as we get closer to that ample reserves cutoff. So now back to the question from the book you said, you recited, which is, are there consequences to this particular tool that we should take in? And I think that is something that we need to study, that there are different points of view. Some people would say there are not as many costs as argued in that book. Others would say there are the costs argued in that book. So I think that is ripe for study. And it's one of the reasons that we don't know as much about that I do put the funds rate as our primary tool, forward guidance is our second tool, and the balance sheet is our third tool, because we do need to learn more about it. I don't think we know what the answer is about those effects, but we certainly need to think about that particular set of ideas and compare it to the other ideas that say this is exactly how to do it. And we just don't have an answer yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Very clear explanations. I could listen to you all day. It's like Alan Greenspan asked somebody when he was giving a congressional testimony, did you understand everything I said? And the senator said, yes. Then you weren't paying attention. But my comment is, was the proximate cause of our current bout of inflation, let's say that started to be high in late 2020 and early 2021, the stimulus that was put into the economy of about $15 trillion, both fiscal and monetary stimulus, with the $3,000 checks and, as you described, the quantitative easing that really stimulated the value of assets. And was that not the proximate cause, a mismatch between the amount of stimulus and the amount of supply that was in the economy?
Let me take that question and let me tell you how I think about it. So certainly we have found the following thing. There was more demand than there was supply. And what we found after the pandemic is demand came roaring back and supply came, crawling back. And so then you ask, well, why? Why was demand so strong? So part of it is support. I would call it support at this point because remember we're in a pandemic, so I don't think of it as stimulus. I think of it as supporting. People are going to fall in a giant hole, and so then the fiscal agents come in and support. The monetary agents come in and support. Historians will ask and we all are doing retrospectives, postmortems, whatever you want to call them, on was it too much? How do we calibrate it? But the way I think about it is it was a pandemic that hadn't happened in 100 years, and the principal idea behind the stimulus or the fiscal support that they were giving in fiscal and that we were giving in monetary was make sure that people, for no fault of their own, don't have their lives and livelihoods destroyed. So that's the principle. But that's only one factor that supported strong demand. The second factor, certainly that's a factor, but the second factor, and a very big factor in what we call excess savings, was the fact that very many people kept their jobs because their employers said go work from home and continued to pay them, but they had nothing to do with their money. They couldn't go anywhere. You can only buy so many things, especially when you have supply chain disruptions. So you can only buy so many things. And so people built up a large stockpile of savings. And so then when the pandemic starts to lift a bit, people want to go out and use those funds. And so this has supported an enormous strength in demand. And some people have called it revenge spending, et cetera. I'm just thinking of it as you've got a lot of money because whether you were supported through some fiscal support, which is only a fraction of the economy, or you were supported simply by having your employer continue to pay you while you worked from home and you saved money on commuting and other things, and then you couldn't do anything. So now you have piles of savings, and now you really have an interest in getting back and catching up on the things you couldn't do before. You want to travel, eat out, go out and do services, see concerts, whatever you want to do. That has been unbridled so far. I mean, you see it time and time again. Consumers are still out there doing these things. So that's where demand is strong. And then why was supply weak? Well, COVID had a much more lasting impact on supply than anyone penciled in. And I think that's because, think about it's a global pandemic. So the US comes out of it, and then Europe gets a surge, and then they close down, and then China gets a surge, and they close down, and then the US gets a surge. And it's spreading, but it's not coordinated. So it's one big shock all at once, but then a long tail of uncoordinated after effects that continue to constrain supply. And supply is almost like once something gets clogged, it's a domino effect. So a port closes in China for 3 weeks, and that backs up everything. And now the ports in LA are stacked up. And it's a system that clogs up quickly and drains slowly, repairs itself slowly. So I really think when you look at proximate causes, you're going to see that the pandemic was a big shock. It affected supply more than it affected demand in terms of a lasting effect. And we ended up with all of this inflation. Now, to answer your specific question about could I link it just back to fiscal and monetary, well, the other countries took a different mix of fiscal and monetary, and many took less fiscal, and they have the same high inflation. So I see that as a cross-check over whether the fiscal alone was the cause. It certainly probably affected the timing of when we...
Combination, though,
it was a combination, right?
You had a huge, I don't know, what the quantitative easing was something like $500 billion at least, to my recollection. And then we all know what the $3,000 checks were. I mean, that was...
But sir, and then I wouldn't go on to the next question, but I'll just say I really want us all to, if you could leave this room with the idea that there were many factors that influenced this imbalance. And so it is, when we study it, and we will continue to study this, and historians will study this, we will find that there were many causes to why we ended up with high inflation, and only one real remedy. And that is to bring demand back in line with supply. The supply chains are recovering, which moves supply. Demand is going down, and that's interest rate policy. So that's, I think, what we're doing. But thank you for your question. I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Yes, of course.
So the Fed is sometimes accused of being reactionary. So using AI as an example, how does the Fed approach something like that to stay within their target versus getting back in target, especially in this type of environment where you're also trying to get back into target?
So what do you mean by reactionary, if I can ask?
It always, I just read headlines.
Probably like responding to data
Yeah.
as it comes in. Maybe.
Versus it's often cited in the headlines, the Fed is taking action to get back within target
I
versus
see.
trying to maintain within target.
I see. So actually, that's okay. Now I understand the question better. Let me talk about. So we are always trying to calibrate the economy, of course, so that we can stay 2% inflation, full employment. But the economy faces shocks all the time. So as you remember, in 2019, we're going along. Things look really good. We have the longest expansion in U.S. history in progress. Inflation is 1.8. We're trying to move it up, and we're actually have a labor market that just keeps adding jobs and keeps adding workers. And then we have a pandemic, and that's just a shock, and that pushes us out of our target. So it is not we push ourselves out of the target. We're always trying to maintain ourselves in the target, but shocks push us out of the target. So that's why when people say, well, you could use AI or something else and you could keep yourself in the range, or a rule that would keep yourself in the range, I think you have to really think about what pushes us out of the range. It is often, almost always, a shock to the economy. A global shock, a domestic shock. It could be, an oil price shock. It could be a pandemic. It could be a war. It could be a supply chain disruption. All of those things can push you off your target, and then our job is to bring it back. So that is how we do our work. And we certainly think of all the different ways we can look ahead more easily, and we can get early warning signs that we're being pushed away. But with the pandemic, it's a great example of what it sometimes is like. You're moving along in the economy, then something massive hits, and your job is no longer just to stay in that target. It's to actually do everything you can do to support the economy. Because really, it could have been millions and millions and millions of people whose lives and livelihoods were completely lost for a long, long time if central banks across the globe hadn't gone in and reduced interest rates and aided, and if fiscal agents hadn't done the same thing. And so that's sort of what it's like. It's a job of you're working in your target until you're not, and then you're doing everything you can to get back in your target.
I think that is all the time that we have. So thank you so much, everyone. This has been wonderful. Thank you, President Daly. This
Terrific.
has been great. Yeah.
It's been terrific. Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everyone.